live from the Azores in Brussels. It's ZN
Live.
Live, very excited. Today we have a very special guest, the new Secretary General of Specialized Nutrition Europe, Beat, who has extensive experience in Brussels. He's been over 22 years working in communication, from the parliament to associations to communication in the food and agri sector. And he's also an EU influencer, so he's been active on Twitter. Beat, great to have you on the show. My first question to you is, how do you think that the conversation around science, this is something that you've really been very involved in, how has it shifted post-COVID and Ukraine, and has the job of communicators become that much more difficult? We need to unmute you. And we're just going to do this again.
That's a good point.
Yeah, perfect. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Hi, Phil. Hi, Liora. And that's already a big question. I would say, well, the COVID part, I think, actually might have made science communication a bit easier in a way, because a lot more people have realized, you know, the importance of the vaccines in this case. And I think the sort of anti-vaxxers have really lost a lot of ground, even if there were some demonstrations. But I do think that the vast majority of the population in probably most or all European countries have sort of come around to accept science in this case more. And with Ukraine, I'm not really so sure. I suppose it also brings home the point that there are very different parallel truths and narratives, and not to say fake news. So I suppose, you know, obviously it's really terrible what's happening there, but if it can at least have sort of as a positive side effect, if it can at least sort of bring the issue of fake news, misinformation higher onto the political agenda, I think that might be, well, certainly welcome from my perspective.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, you know, we've observed this because we've worked very actively in science communication vaccine, is that it's become a more and more complicated conversation. Yes, there has been a lot of vaccine communication, but the anti-vax movement, or the vaccine hesitant, has actually grown a lot. So it's been very, very complicated and very challenging. And I think when you're communicating on science, we're communicating on very complicated ideas, and sometimes simplifying them is really a big challenge. So you've been working in that space, you know, in agri science, now in food. So as an influencer, somebody who's actually very active in your space, what is your approach to communicating on complicated matters online, especially on Twitter?
Yeah, so maybe what I'll say is more focused now on my sort of past 10, 11 years when I was working on biotech and GMOs. And I don't have a master recipe, of course, but I think, well, what I try to do is to bring it back. I suppose you have to play with the levels, right? You don't want to get into, I mean, ideally you want to comment on something or reply to something that may look quite technical at a sort of higher level that brings it back to the more fundamental truth. I don't know. I mean, what I liked to do quite a lot is to refer back to the scientific evidence that wasn't really that complicated in the case of GMOs, because they've always been shown by all the by all the big scientific bodies and by risk assessors, EFSA and others worldwide, to be as safe as any other type of seed. And there are, of course, a lot of meta studies, what have you, about that, statements from the academies of science and so on. So usually when I felt I had to counter some misperception around that, I just sort of said, well, actually, there's a scientific consensus, you know, check here and here and here, and you sort of 3 links might be a little bit boring, but yeah, and then of course there are a lot of the discussions linked to GMOs and biotech were much more, well, it wasn't really about the science, or maybe it isn't. Most of the discussions aren't really about the science, but it's more about, it's linked to people's belief systems, right? And that's much more, yeah, and then I think, I guess it might be the same for the vaccine story, but certainly for biotech, then of course you kind of, you can't, it wasn't my job, I think, to please everybody. It wasn't my job to convince the last few, but sort of to maybe, I was really trying to, yeah, to raise a bit more awareness sort of in the middle ground, people who were somehow interested, including, of course, political actors, but who can't possibly know about all these things. And if one of them looks at a European Academies of Science paper summary on GMOs, and I thought that was already a small achievement in this context. Yeah.
Yeah, but the issue is, I think that people basically, if you send links to studies, very few people will go and read those studies because that requires a lot of work. And so the question, I think, as communicators, is how do you simplify without manipulating or exaggerating your point? And I think that the discussion on GMOs in Europe is a very ideological and emotional one, very, very controversial for many people. And so the question is, do you think the conversations, how do you make the conversations more about science when that's harder and requires more work? And if that's difficult, how do you bring emotion into a complicated scientific subject?
I mean, I think the objective for me in that former job was always to, yes, of course, to remain science-based in the communication, but very much what you're saying, Phil, to try and simplify it without becoming, of course, without becoming wrong. I mean, to still stay sort of on the safe side, but simplified enough so that it hopefully becomes interesting. Of course, we did also the usual thing, fact sheets and stuff, but on social media, I think what I often did was just to include a screenshot of sort of the main, what I considered perhaps the main sentence of that, for example, European Academies of Science report, which was already a summary anyway, and which just, I think it said something like, biotech is whatever is very promising for sustainable agriculture, and I mean something, a simple sentence like that. And I think what I tried to do in those years is really to keep an eye out for any quotes from, of course, respected authorities, that are really easy enough for anyone to understand. And then if they have a doubt about it, and then the few people who would actually click a link, I did always prefer to provide a link, or at least I tried to do so, because then it's not just me quoting something of my choice, but people can actually check if they want. So that's somehow how I try to find a bit that balance, to have sometimes very pointed and shortened arguments, as you need to do, I guess, especially on Twitter, but to at least provide people the possibility to read up a little bit.
Yeah. So I think being a source of news, I think is very important. Do you think that this, I mean, in an area where people are already maybe convinced and have strong ideological beliefs, how much of an impact do you think communication has on changing people's beliefs? Because on the one hand, it seems to be that if people have preconceptions, it might be really hard to change them, especially if they're core ideologies. But at the same time, a lot of these new ideologies, whether it's anti-vax, flat earthers, or whatever, seems to have come out of social media. So in your experience, how effective is this at changing people's opinion, or at least making them understand something they didn't understand before?
It's another super difficult question, Phil. I guess in my mind, there is really, there's just different groups of people, isn't there? So there are definitely those who have strong opinions and who are the most vocal. And of course, in a way, probably most of us who do communicate on social media kind of are trapped also to some extent in that, in this really outspoken, convinced group, whichever topic it may be on. But then there's also a lot of people who may be difficult to reach, but who haven't thought all that much about things. I mean, I remember, and this is not social media related now, but I remember sort of one of the first meetings where I heard something about pesticides in some kind of DG Agri meeting when I was still working for the retail sector, back when I really didn't have an idea about agriculture. And somebody from the Pesticides Association just said, actually, it doesn't only protect harvests, it also often makes the food safer. I thought, well, I never thought about that. That's actually interesting. Is that really true? So, I think we can't hope to convince almost any of those who have a sort of opposed worldview. But hopefully some sort of in the middle ground, some open-minded people, and I hope there are still some. I think there are still some, because also what we said before about vaccines, I mean, what happened in France, that was the country with the biggest anti-vax population in Europe, if I remember it well. And then once Macron sort of put his fist on the table and said, now we're going to take sort of strict measures and you guys better get vaccinated. Well, almost everybody did within a few weeks. And then you could really see that there is only a pretty small hardcore, and a lot of other people are just sort of, they haven't thought about it really, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, first of all, opinions can be changed. I think we've seen that throughout the pandemic, in the sense that I think people are just very confused and they don't know where to go for information. And so, because it takes work and it takes a mindset of saying, I'm going to check my source, I'm going to ask questions, and I'm not going to just jump to the first simple narrative, which is something that a lot of people do. As you said, there's a spectrum of opinions, from the anti-science, or people who are who identify themselves so strongly with a specific belief that they just do not want to change their mind. And there are a lot of people in the middle. I think that a big portion of people who are actually trying to better understand things genuinely, and really don't know where to go with that. And I believe Leo has a question.
Yeah, Beat, I have a question, because you're currently working for an organization that also represents baby food, formula, for example. And what we often see in these types of situations is that associations are a bit apprehensive to really engage in conversation, thinking that it will just stir more problems. I'm talking, of course, about the formula versus breastfeeding debate. How do you feel about this? Is this something you're going to go full frontal into? Are you going to play it safe? What is your thinking?
Well, it's you won't find a lot on that from me on the social media yet, but indeed it's a discussion. I mean, the one on formula, it is a discussion that I wasn't aware of. Well, they told me in my job interviews, but I mean, yeah, one thing I just found very interesting is that, I mean, in my 10, 11 years on biotech, I really did a bit of an effort to try and look outside the box and look what other sort of similar discussions are there, what other sort of activism is there, and how, I mean, I was, quite interested, or am still quite interested really in what we are discussing today. How do you get, these different worldviews and people having very different whatever understandings of the science and so on. Here on the baby formula, I think it's really not that much about the science. We actually industry agrees that for the baby, breastfeeding is the best thing, but it's not, well, formula come fairly close, but it's not the same. I mean, and we have that on our website and everything. So it's more about marketing practices and things like that. So it's a little bit more of a complex discussion, but still, I believe, as was the case on biotech, where my industry then was very hesitant to talk about it in Europe, at least. My approach is also, I think, yeah, even if it might be an even more difficult discussion, I think it's never advisable to just hide away. I think it's part of our jobs also as trade association people to help communicate, and sometimes there are very good reasons for also big companies who have also other brands to be very careful in their conversation. But I see in general a need for a division of labor. One of the reasons why people have trade associations, I like to think, is also that they take a part of the communications on. So
yeah. No, I think absolutely. I think it's very interesting. And when we take on a new client, there's often a kind of phase where we have to educate ourselves and really try to understand what is the story, because these in Brussels and in the EU, you have these very specific areas, and you start investigating. What does it mean? What is the science? What is the topic which you never heard about before? So at least we're forced to try to educate ourselves and to think critically of all the different points of view, because you can't go into this if you don't try to explore all the facets of an argument. But I'd like to ask you, I mean, are you optimistic about the future of science communication?
Yeah, I think in the longer term, yes, and but it's difficult to say why. I guess I've read a few too many books, like oh God, what's it called again? The Factfulness, for example. These kind of books, where basically proponents of the good old scientific worldview and of enlightenment and so on kind of show that the world has become a better place. And I mean, despite crises and well, new wars even, I mean, if we look back in the longer term, for a number of decades or even centuries, so many things have become much better, and science and innovation has really played a big part in that. And what part communication can play in that, I'm still not really so sure. I think it has a part to play, but also the social media. I mean, the opponents to the opposition to innovation isn't only a new phenomenon, right? It's maybe become more visible with social media, but yeah, I mean, there's also books about that where there are case studies about sort of coffee being introduced gradually in Europe, and then it was banned by many courts because people started talking about politics in the cafes, and or the bridge builders in the first bridge in London that they built. Of course, the ferrymen protested against that. I mean, for very logical reasons. So it's not a new phenomenon. I think it's just become maybe a little bit more visible and perhaps more, more confrontational even. I don't know. And then the social media in this, I think it's just something that it's an important aspect of life today. I mean, I kind of like it. In some way, I'm sure the social media activities have also deepened some of the trenches and made some of the divisions bigger. But on the other hand, it also enables everyone to, I suppose, to learn more and to get to know other interesting people more easily and so on. So I mean, I think we won't I don't think there's a real solution. I think it's a very important issue to think about how can we well, maybe not put rules to the game, but I mean, I know there have been some efforts to try and at least identify blatant misinformation, disinformation, and so on. And I think that kind of stuff is quite important. Because it's in a way, I think it's connected. There have been work streams, I believe, at the EU level about sort of Russian-sponsored disinformation on the internet for some years now, not just since the latest war. But to my knowledge, not so much has really happened. And okay, it's a different thing, huh? But I'm just saying. There's also a lot of misinformation on food-related, agriculture-related things, for example, and some of it is just relayed, I think, by people who don't know better, but some of it is also generated, I mean, on purpose by people who, well, who sort of should really know that it's misinformation. Difficult to manage, I guess, yeah.
All right, thanks a lot. So you say you like social media, and we see that because in 2019, ZN gave you the EU Influencer Award for agriculture. I'm wondering what happened since, because you kind of dropped off the list. And are you now planning to become an influencer for food and drink? We have a new ranking coming up in September. So, and how has it changed your life?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks a lot. I was very honored, of course, and am still by that. I certainly included in my CV the little award that you guys gave me together with your active, I believe it was. And otherwise, has it changed my life? Well, it let's say it like this. I mean, at the time, I did invest quite a bit, also personally and also professionally, in the social media. I took the award as a confirmation, I guess, also that's an important thing to do. Don't count me in for this year. I think I'm still quite new in my new area. I occasionally still, I still follow a bit my old stuff, of course, privately as well. So you might see more on that in my social media profile, in my private social media profile, I should say. But there is an ambition in my new trade association, SNE, to also become more visible. It's from a rather low level, I have to say, but I've already helped to for the moment to double our Twitter followership. I know it's not all about followership, and certainly intend to help make this association more communicative as well over time.
No, that's beautiful and a lovely note to end on. On that note, thank you so much for all your insights today. Thank you, Phil, for joining us, even from the Azores. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, but I'm sure I am. And I think it's going to be a hot, rainy, and stormy weekend. So here in Brussels, anyway. So enjoy all of that. Or
thank you.
And see you next week. Thank you so much, Beat.
Thanks a lot. Same to you. Thank you.
Thank
Enjoy.
you. Bye.